Have you ever noticed that some companies don't fail dramatically? They don't make headlines, they don't appear in scandals, and yet they simply disappear? They don't explode. They don't fall all at once. They continue to exist for a while, functioning, operating, making decisions, while something essential is gradually lost. And the question that almost no one asks is, how can a company collapse without anyone realizing it is happening? Most people associate business failure with obvious crises, glaring bad decisions, or obvious strategic mistakes. But reality is often much quieter. True collapse rarely begins in chaos. It starts in normality. It starts when everything seems under control. When routines remain intact, reports are not scary, meetings continue to happen, and no one feels enough urgency to question what is behind this apparent stability. It is in this comfortable environment that the most dangerous decisions tend to be born. Companies do not disappear because they stop operating overnight. They disappear because they continue to function while they fail to adapt. They continue making decisions while losing sensitivity. They continue to advance while walking in the wrong direction. Slow collapse is treacherous precisely because it does not stop the flow. It installs without noise, without alarm, without clear warning. And the quieter it is, the harder it becomes to notice it. There is something deeply human behind this process. Human behavior tends to avoid discomfort. We tend to trust what has always worked. We tend to interpret the absence of visible problems as a sign that everything is fine. Within companies, this psychological mechanism is amplified. Normality becomes an argument. Stability becomes justification. The lack of crisis becomes proof that it is not time for change. And so, small, silent decisions begin to shape the future without attracting attention. The most disturbing thing is that almost no one wakes up thinking that they are leading a company to collapse. On the contrary, most decisions that contribute to this process seem rational, prudent, and even responsible at the time they are made. Postpone a difficult change, avoid internal conflict, minimize a nuisance signal, believe that there is still time. Each choice, in isolation, seems harmless, but their accumulated effect creates something far more dangerous than a single mistake. It creates an invisible pattern. This pattern does not manifest itself in dramatic charts or numbers that suddenly plummet. It appears in small details, in talents that leave in silence, in customers who stop recommending, in teams that continue to deliver, but without real involvement, in decisions that are always pushed to the next quarter. None of this seems urgent enough to trigger a breakup. And that is exactly why the collapse is advancing. Few people talk about this type of failure because it is not easy to identify. There is no clear villain. There is no specific moment to point to. The slow collapse offers no simple narrative. It is built on repetition, in the routine, in the sum of silent decisions that go unnoticed while the company still appears solid on the outside. When the problem finally becomes visible, much of the damage has already been done. Maybe you've already seen something like this happen. Maybe in a large company, maybe in a smaller one, maybe even in a project or team. Situations where everything seemed normal, but something wasn't right. In which decisions continued to be made, but the sense of direction was lost. If this scenario sounds familiar to you, that's no coincidence. This pattern is repeated more often than one might imagine, in different sectors, cultures, and contexts. And this is exactly where we need to stop for a moment and look more closely. Because before understanding how these companies disappear, you need to understand how the collapse begins to form when no one is looking. In the next part, we will enter that silent territory where normality stops being security and becomes the biggest risk of all. And before we go even deeper into this topic, there is something important that needs to be said. This type of analysis is not common on YouTube precisely because it requires attention, reflection, and above all, intellectual honesty. It is not content made for quick or distracted consumption. It touches on patterns that many people prefer to ignore, because recognizing these signs implies admitting that silent decisions are part of our own professional reality. Therefore, if at any point up until now something made sense to you, if any phrase caused you discomfort, identification, or memory, I want you to participate in this conversation. Comments play a much bigger role than just numbers. They show that this subject is not abstract, that it exists outside the theoretical framework, IA, and manifests itself in real companies, real teams, and real professional trajectories. When someone shares an experience, a perception, or even a simple identifying phrase, this expands the scope of reflection. It helps others see patterns that they may not have noticed on their own. So if you've ever seen a company functioning normally while something was clearly getting lost, write it in the comments. It could be something simple like, "This is real. I've seen it happen." Or, "Everything seemed normal." If this content is making you think differently about business decisions, human behavior, and silent meltdowns, leaving a like is a direct way to show that this type of analysis has value. It is not just a gesture of support for the channel, but a signal to the platform that deep reflections, even without a show, deserve space. The more people interact, the more this type of content reaches those who may be just at the moment of ignoring important signals without realizing it. And if you're not already subscribed, consider signing up now. The next videos follow exactly this line, not telling obvious stories of failure, but exploring the psychological behind the scenes, invisible patterns, and silent decisions that shape the destiny of companies long before any crisis appears. This channel is for those who want to understand what almost no one explains, and for those who prefer depth instead of simple answers. Now from here, we need to move on to an even more sensitive point, because understanding that the collapse begins in normality is just the first step. What really matters is understanding why, despite noticing subtle signs, people choose not to act. This is exactly where silence stops being just context and starts to become collective behavior. And it is at this point that the collapse begins to take shape irreversibly. When everything still works, almost no one suspects danger. This is the most disconcerting point of every silent collapse. The company is open, the doors have not closed, the systems continue to run, contracts are still signed, the teams continue to work. There is billing, there are meetings, there are goals, there is planning. From the outside, the perception is of continuity. Inside, the feeling is normal. And that's exactly where the risk starts to become invisible. The beginning of the collapse does not appear as a crisis, but as a routine. Decisions continue to be made at the same times by the same groups with the same arguments. The reports don't scare enough to generate real tension. The numbers don't drop, they just stop improving. Hiring continues to happen, albeit with less conviction. Growth is no longer accelerated, but it is not alarming either. Everything seems acceptable, and when something is acceptable, it is rarely questioned in depth. There is a powerful psychological trap in this scenario. The human brain interprets functioning as a safety signal. If something is still standing, if it still produces results, if it still responds minimally to expectations, the natural tendency is to conclude that there is no reason for drastic changes. The absence of chaos becomes confused with real stability. Continuity becomes proof of success, and this silent logic begins to shape the behavior of leaders, managers, and teams without anyone noticing. Collapsed companies rarely give clear signs at the outset because collapse is not born of disruption, but of repetition. Processes are repeated that no longer keep up with the current context. Decisions are repeated that worked in the past, but that have lost their grip in the present. Justifications are repeated that sound rational but only serve to keep everything as it is. The danger is not in explicitly getting it wrong, but in continuing to get it partially right while the environment changes completely. When everything works, the sense of urgency disappears. And without urgency, there is no deep questioning. Small problems are treated as exceptions. Subtle warnings are relativized. Uncomfortable signals are pushed into the future. After all, if the company is still operating, if customers are still buying, if cash is still breathing, why act now? Why create tension? Why mess with something that, on the surface, doesn't look broken? This is the invisible beginning of the collapse. The belief that there is still time. The idea that the current situation allows us to wait a little longer. Another quarter, another cycle, another slight adjustment. This logic creates a dangerous delay between perception and action. While the organization waits for a clearer signal, the external environment continues to transform. Competitors adapt. Consumer behaviors change. Technologies evolve. But internally, the company remains stuck in the feeling that it is still in control. Continuous functioning creates a false sense of competence. The organization comes to believe that because still standing, your decisions continue to be effective. This thinking ignores a fundamental detail. Something can work and still be becoming irrelevant, can operate without being healthy. You can invoice without being prepared for the next cycle. The most dangerous collapse is not the one that halts operations, but the one that allows everything to continue while adaptive capacity silently deteriorates. At this stage, The breakdown does not generate fear, it generates comfort. The comfort of knowing that nothing exploded. The comfort of maintaining known routines. The comfort of not having to face difficult conversations. And the greater this comfort, the less willingness to see risks that do not manifest themselves immediately. The problem is not the lack of information, but its interpretation. Neutral data will be read as positive. Stagnation comes to be seen as stability. Slowness becomes confused with caution. The most disturbing thing is that almost everyone involved believes they are acting responsibly. There is no explicit negligence. There is no intention of failing. On the contrary, decisions are made based on logical, historical, and apparently solid arguments. The error is not in the isolated decision, but in the context in which it is made. A context in which functioning became sufficient criteria to continue. A context in which not breaking became synonymous with being well. While everything still works, the breakdown learns to disguise itself. It infiltrates language, habits, priorities. The company begins to protect itself more from discomfort than from irrelevance. Start preserving processes instead of questioning them. Begin to value internal predictability more than reading the external environment. And all this happens without fanfare, without noise, without visible resistance. That's why this beginning is so dangerous. Because it doesn't provoke a strong emotional reaction. It doesn't generate panic. Does not interrupt the routine. It just creates a silent ground where decisions start to be made based on continuity rather than adaptation. Where does the question stop being, where are we going? And it becomes just, how to maintain what already exists. And when this change happens, even if in a subtle way, something fundamental has already begun to shift beneath the surface. Restlessness appears only as an internal noise, difficult to name, a vague feeling that something no longer keeps pace with the world. But while everything still works, this restlessness is easily drowned out. After all, if everything works, why would that be dangerous? The normality that sets in after this invisible beginning is perhaps the most deceptive element of the entire process, because it does not present itself as an error, nor as negligence, nor as a failure. It presents itself as maturity, like stability, as a sign that the company has found a comfortable operating rhythm. Things don't grow like they used to, but they don't fall apart either. Nothing explodes, nothing deviates drastically, and precisely for this reason, normality starts to be treated as evidence that decisions remain correct. Within organizations, normality creates its own language. Reports begin to use terms such as expected, controlled, in line with history. Meetings no longer have in-depth debates and start to reinforce consensus. More incisive questions sound exaggerated, almost out of place. After all, if there is no crisis, why so much concern? If everything continues to work, why change something that has apparently found balance? The problem is that normality rarely reflects real health. It just reflects repetition. Processes continue to happen because they always have. Decisions follow the same paths because they have already been validated in the past. Structures remain intact because they have not yet collapsed. And this constant repetition creates a collective anesthesia. The longer everything stays the same, the less sensitivity there is to notice small changes that indicate wear and tear. The trap is that normality does not require action. It doesn't create urgency. It does not generate enough emotional tension to cause rupture. On the contrary, it rewards maintaining the status quo. Leaders who maintain stability are seen as responsible. Managers who avoid risks are considered prudent. Teams that do not generate conflicts are interpreted as aligned. Normality becomes celebrated as a virtue, when in fact it may just be a sign of silent stagnation. In this scenario, human behavior acts in a predictable way. The brain searches for familiar patterns. He feels comfortable when the environment does not require frequent adaptations, when decisions do not challenge deeply held beliefs, when the future seems like a predictable extension of the past. This search for predictability means that subtle signs of change are interpreted as temporary noise, not as signs of structural transformation. The company then begins to combine the absence of visible problems with the absence of risks. As there is no immediate collapse, it is believed that the current model is still sufficient. As there are no abrupt losses, it is concluded that the choices continue to be correct. This reasoning ignores an essential detail. Risks rarely accumulate linearly. They accumulate silently until they reach a point where small corrections are no longer enough. Normality also changes the way time is perceived. Everything seems less urgent. Difficult decisions are postponed because it is not the time. Deep changes are postponed because you can still adjust. Time starts to be seen as an ally when in fact it is being consumed. Each crisis-free cycle reinforces the belief that there is still margin, there is still space, there is still control. And so the organization gradually moves away from external reality without realizing it. Another dangerous effect of normality is the reduction of internal questioning. People who previously raised concerns begin to remain silent, not because they stopped noticing problems, but because they learned that normality does not reward alertness. Alerting starts to seem like creating a problem where there is none. Questioning starts to sound like a lack of alignment. Little by little, the company develops a culture where silence is interpreted as maturity and disagreement as unnecessary noise. This culture is not built by explicit orders. It emerges from observed behavior. When warnings are ignored, people learn. When questions do not generate action, they stop being asked. When decisions continue to be postponed without immediate consequences, postponement becomes normalized. The result is an organization that works but doesn't listen, that operates but does not reflect, that remains stable but loses its ability to adapt. Normality is deceiving because it masks the invisible cost of inaction. Not taking action seems neutral, but it is not. Every decision not made preserves current comfort at the expense of future flexibility. Each relativized problem increases the distance between internal perception and external reality. The company continues to move, but in increasingly tighter circles. And the more comfortable this movement becomes, the less energy there is to break away from it. The most critical point is that this normality creates a powerful internal narrative, that the company is resilient precisely because it does not react impulsively. This narrative reinforces slowness, justifies excessive caution, and turns adaptation into something secondary. Collapse in this context is not seen as a threat, but as something distant, reserved for less prepared organizations. The company sees itself as an exception, not part of a pattern. As long as this perception remains, the collapse continues to advance invisibly, not because something stopped working, but because everything continues to work within a model that no longer follows the surrounding environment. Normality ceases to be a sign of balance and becomes the main mechanism for hiding the problem. And when that happens, the risk is no longer just in the market or in the strategy, but in the way the organization itself interprets reality. Over time, this sustained normality begins to produce an even more subtle and dangerous effect. Decline no longer feels like decline. Nothing disappears at once. Nothing drops drastically. The losses are not evident enough to provoke an emotional reaction. They appear as small acceptable variations, as natural market adjustments, as normal side effects of a competitive environment. And precisely for this reason, they begin to be absorbed into the routine without causing disruption. Talents start to leave, but there is always a plausible explanation. The market is hot. It was a personal decision. He got a better offer. Each exit in isolation seems understandable. There is no stampede. There is no protest. Just a substitution here, another there. The company continues to operate, so the loss of human capital is not felt immediately. The real impact, knowledge that is lost, vision that disappears, warnings that are no longer made, becomes invisible. The same goes for customers. Complaints increase gradually but never enough to generate panic. Some stop renewing, others reduce consumption, others simply stop recommending. None of this appears as a breakdown. It looks like natural wear and tear, the kind of thing that has always happened and will always happen. The company adjusts speeches, reviews superficial processes, but does not question the root. After all, there are still customers, there is still revenue, there is still operation. This fragmented interpretation prevents decline from being perceived as a continuous process. Instead of seeing a pattern, the organization sees isolated events. Each problem is treated separately, disconnected from the others. An employee leaving is not related to a drop in engagement. A customer complaint does not connect. There is an internal delay. An indicator that worsens slightly is not seen as a symptom, but as a statistical variation. The whole is lost in the sum of the parts. There is a psychological comfort in treating decline this way. Recognizing a pattern would require admitting that something structural needs to change. It would require questioning past decisions. It would require deconstructing internal narratives of competence and control. Treating everything as punctual preserves the image of stability. It preserves the feeling that it is enough to adjust here and there. The problem is that the decline does not function as a correctable event. It works like a silent buildup. The organization then begins to operate in defensive mode without realizing it. Instead of seeking evolution, it starts to avoid greater losses. Instead of building the future, it tries to protect the present. This change in stance is not announced, but is reflected in decisions. More daring projects are shelved. Strategic investments are postponed. Initiatives that would require disruption are replaced by incremental improvements. The objective stops being to advance and becomes not to get worse. Decline that doesn't feel like decline also alters risk perception. As nothing explicitly went wrong, the risk becomes underestimated. The company believes it can react quickly if something worse happens. There is a belief that, when it's serious, we will understand. This belief ignores the fact that the longer the decline continues, the less capacity to react. The delay is not just strategic, it is psychological. Another important effect of this stage is the redefinition of what is considered acceptable. What would previously have been seen as a warning sign is now tolerated. Delays become standard. Small falls become normal. Gradual losses became part of the game. The line of acceptable moves slowly, almost imperceptibly. And when someone tries to point this out, it seems like an exaggeration, because the reference has already changed. The company gets used to operating at a lower level without recognizing that it has gone down. This is one of the most dangerous moments of the entire process, because decline does not generate enough fear to provoke change, but it generates enough accommodation to prevent evolution. The organization is not in crisis, but it is not healthy either. She exists in an in-between space where everything seems manageable, and while this space remains, decisions continue to be made based on the idea that it's not that bad. Little by little, the company begins to lose something that does not appear in the reports. Sensitivity. Sensitivity to notice changes early. Sensitivity to hear weak signals. Sensitivity to accept that something needs to be reviewed before it becomes urgent. When this sensitivity is lost, decline stops being just an external process and becomes an internal state. The organization adapts to its own wear and tear, and it is at this point that the silent decline stops being a coincidence and becomes a pattern. Not because someone consciously decided to follow this path, but because the sum of small tolerances created an environment where losing little by little seems normal, where gradual disappearance does not sound like a threat, but like an inevitable part of the cycle. And when that happens, the next stage is already being prepared, even if no one can yet name it. As decline becomes absorbed as part of the routine, an even more delicate phenomenon emerges: collective silence. It is not a silence imposed by explicit rules or direct orders. It's a learned silence, a silence that comes from observing the environment. People realize that certain issues don't move forward, that certain alerts don't generate change, that certain concerns create more exhaustion than results, and, little by little, they learn to choose what to say, and especially what not to say. At this stage, most already feel that something is not right. The uneasiness exists, but it doesn't find a safe space to turn into real conversation. Questioning starts to feel risky. Raising doubts starts to sound like a lack of alignment. Pointing out problems is mistaken for negativity. And so, even without anyone declaring it out loud, an implicit agreement is formed. It's better not to be the first to speak. Collective silence is strengthened because it offers psychological protection. When no one speaks, no one exposes themselves. When no one confronts, no one takes the risk of being wrong. The absence of conflict is interpreted as harmony, when in fact it is just evasion. Meetings continue to happen. Decisions continue to be made. But the most important conversations cease to exist. What is discussed is the operational aspect. The structural is left out. This behavior spreads quickly. People watch those who try to raise deeper issues and notice the system's reaction. If there is no listening, if there is no response, if there is no change, the message becomes clear. There is no point in insisting. Little by little, silence stops being the exception and becomes the norm. Bad. Not because everyone agrees, but because everyone has adapted. The most dangerous thing is that this silence doesn't seem like a problem. On the contrary, it creates an artificial feeling of emotional stability. Less conflicts, fewer difficult debates, less apparent tension. For many leaders, this is interpreted as organizational maturity. The team seems aligned. Meetings flow quickly. Decisions are approved without resistance. Everything seems efficient. But this efficiency is illusory because it eliminates the very element that prevents silent breakdowns, healthy confrontation. When no one wants to be the first to speak, the error stops being individual and becomes collective. Each person believes that if the problem was really serious, someone more experienced would speak up. Someone above would speak. Someone with more authority would intervene. This silent transfer of responsibility creates a dangerous vacuum. Everyone waits, no one acts, and all the while, decisions continue to be made within an increasingly narrow field of perception. Collective silence also distorts the way information circulates. Data begins to be filtered before it even reaches the highest levels, not through explicit manipulation, but through anticipation of a reaction. Uncomfortable information is softened. Risks are presented as controllable. Negative trends are explained as temporary. The system learns to protect itself from news that would demand real change. In this environment, consensus stops being a sign of alignment and becomes a sign of omission. Decisions are made quickly because almost no one objects. But speed without diversity of thought is not agility, it is fragility. The organization begins to operate with a narrow view of reality, believing that it is moving forward when in fact, it is just avoiding discomfort. Collective silence is especially dangerous because it creates the illusion of choice. It appears that decisions are the result of genuine agreement, when in fact, they are the result of silent withdrawal. People don't agree, they just don't see room to disagree. And when disagreement disappears, the organization loses its ability to correct itself before it is too late. This is the moment when collapse stops being just an invisible process and starts to be actively sustained by human behavior. Not out of malice, not out of incompetence, but out of adaptation. Silence becomes an internal survival mechanism, and when surviving internally becomes more important than adapting externally, direction has already begun to be irreversibly lost. When collective silence is already in place, something curious happens. The company does not stand still. On the contrary, she becomes more active, busier, more full of meetings, plans, and initiatives. This is the time when activity increases but direction is lost. There is constant movement, but little real transformation. To those observing from the outside, it appears that the organization is reacting. For those inside, there is a feeling of effort. But this effort rarely translates into structural change. The activity starts to function as a psychological anesthetic. The more things are happening, the less room there is to question whether they make sense. Full schedules create the illusion of progress. Strategic plans create a feeling of control. New projects emerge as an automatic response to unrest, but without attacking the root of the problem. The company moves to avoid facing the fact that it doesn't know exactly where it is going. At this stage, decisions begin to fragment even more. Instead of clear choices, specific adjustments emerge, minor route corrections that do not change the main path. Names, structures, intermediate goals change. Teams are reorganized. Presentations have been reformulated. Everything looks new, but the core behavior remains intact. The company continues to avoid difficult decisions while occupying time with actions that seem productive. There is also an important narrative reinforcement here. The organization begins to tell itself an adaptation story. There is talk of repositioning, reviewing priorities, learning cycles. These narratives are not necessarily false, but they are incomplete. They serve to justify the lack of profound change. Language becomes more sophisticated while reality remains the same. Speech evolves faster than behavior. The problem with this directionless activity is that it consumes valuable resources. Time, energy, attention, and capital are spent keeping the system running, not preparing it for the future. People work more, but feel less impact. The feeling of tiredness increases, while clarity decreases. The more the company does, the less it knows if it is doing the right thing. And this silent confusion spreads throughout the organization. Another important effect is the dilution of responsibility. With many initiatives underway, therefore, it is difficult to pinpoint what really matters. Priorities get confused. Everything seems urgent, so nothing is essential. Decision-making becomes reactive, based on what comes first, not what is most relevant. The company responds to internal stimuli while losing the ability to accurately read the external environment. This phase also creates a false sense of learning. Mistakes happen, adjustments are made, but without deep reflection. You learn to better execute what is already being done, not to question whether it still makes sense. Learning becomes operational, not strategic. The company becomes more efficient in a model that has already begun to lose its validity. The illusion of movement is dangerous because it removes the perception of stagnation. When everything is in constant activity, it is difficult to accept that the organization is at a standstill in what really matters. True change requires pause, analysis, and confrontation. It requires reducing noise to see patterns, but in an environment saturated with tasks and initiatives, there is no space for this type of reflection. Constant activity protects the system from real change. Little by little, the company begins to confuse effort with progress. Those who work hard feel like they are contributing. Those who lead many initiatives feel like they are taking action. But acting without direction does not prevent collapse. It just makes it more tiring. The organization moves forward but without correcting course. And the longer you spend in this state, the harder it becomes to stop, reflect, and redirect. This is the moment when the collapse becomes particularly treacherous, because everything seems active, organized, and under control. But behind this intense movement, the company has already lost something fundamental: clarity about what really needs to be decided. And without clarity, decisions continue to be postponed or diluted in actions that maintain the feeling of progress, but do not change the destination. At some point, even if belatedly, external reality begins to impose itself, not as an immediate shock, but as a constant pressure that can no longer be easily ignored. The market has changed. Customers have changed. Expectations have changed. New competitors emerged with lighter, faster models, more connected to current behavior. But within the company, the perception is still stuck in a scenario that no longer exists. This mismatch creates an uncomfortable situation. From the outside, the company begins to appear slow, predictable, and not very relevant. From the inside, the feeling is that there is still time to react. The organization believes that it can adjust when necessary, that all it takes is one right movement to recover space. The problem is that this "when necessary" has already passed, and no one realized exactly when it happened. The company always reacts one step behind, observes trends after they have consolidated, adjusts products after interest has waned, reviews strategies when results are already compromised. Each decision seems logical at the time it is made, but comes too late to have any real impact. The delay is not just operational, it is psychological. The organization is slow to accept that the context has changed irreversibly. There is also strong internal resistance at this stage. Admitting that the world has changed means admitting that previous decisions are no longer useful. It means accepting that successful models have lost their validity. For leaders and teams who have built identity around these decisions, this acceptance is difficult. It is more comfortable to believe that the market is overreacting, that the change is temporary, that the fundamentals remain solid. This belief sustains inertia. Meanwhile, external signs accumulate. Customers become less loyal. Strategic partnerships weaken. The perceived value of the company decreases. Comparisons with competitors become unfavorable. Even so, the internal reaction remains cautious, fragmented, and late. The company adjusts details when what is required is transformation, and this difference in scale between the problem and the response accelerates burnout. The most dangerous thing is that, at this point, the organization still believes it is in control. There are plans, projections, scenarios. There is a feeling that everything can be rearranged if necessary. But this control is illusory. It is based on old premises applied to a new context. The company tries to solve current problems with mental tools from the past. And the more you do this, the further you become from the reality you need to face. Confrontation with the external world does not happen all at once. It arises in repeated small frustrations, launches that don't gain traction, strategies that do not generate the expected return, efforts that consume energy but do not produce relevance. Each failed attempt reinforces the feeling that something is not working. But still, the organization resists changing what really matters, because changing what is essential requires abandoning old certainties. At this stage, the collapse is no longer just internal. It begins to be perceived externally. The brand loses symbolic strength. The company is no longer a reference. Interest wanes. Internal silence finds an echo in external disinterest. But as this happens gradually, It still seems possible to recover everything with one last well-executed movement. This late hope sustains inaction longer than it should. External reality does not wait. It does not slow down to allow late adaptation. While the company debates, the world moves forward. While the organization protects internal structures, the surrounding environment transforms. And when this difference becomes too great, the space for reaction quickly closes. The collapse, which seemed distant, begins to become inevitable. At this point, something fundamental has already been lost: timing. And without timing, even the right decisions can fail. The company may finally recognize that it needs to change, but change already requires a level of disruption that few are willing to face. This is where the slow collapse stops being just a silent possibility and begins to reveal itself as a direct consequence of everything that has been avoided until then. When the collapse finally becomes visible, it does not present itself as a dramatic event. There is no specific day that marks the end. There is no single moment that can be pointed to as the cause. What emerges is a strange feeling of emptying. The company still exists, but it no longer occupies the same space. It still operates, but it no longer matters in the same way. It still works, but it has lost something that doesn't appear in the reports: relevance. This disappearance happens without scandal. It doesn't make news. It does not generate public shock. Little by little, the company stops being mentioned. It stops being a reference, stops being remembered. Customers move on. Talents look for other places. The market rearranges its priorities without waiting. For those inside, the feeling is confusing. It seems like everything happened too quickly. For those who observe from a distance, the process has been visible for a long time. The slow breakdown is especially cruel because it offers no catharsis. There is no clear villain to blame. There is no single decision that explains everything. What exists is a sequence of predictable human choices, accumulated silences, preserved comforts, alerts ignored, decisions postponed. Each step seemed too small to justify radical change, but together, they built a path of no return. In this final stage, many organizations try to reinterpret their own history. They seek narratives that make failure more acceptable. They talk about natural cycles, inevitable changes, uncontrollable external forces. These explanations are not completely false, but they are incomplete. They ignore the central factor: human behavior that sustained silence for too long. The collapse was not imposed. He was allowed. The most disturbing thing is to realize that none of this required incompetence.
Intelligent, experienced, and well-intentioned people participated at every stage. The problem was never a lack of technical capacity. It was too much psychological comfort. It was the difficulty of breaking normality when it still seemed safe. It was the constant choice of what preserved internal stability rather than what required real adaptation. When the company is already at this point, even correct decisions have limited effect. The time that was consumed by silence cannot be recovered.
The space for smooth adjustments is gone. Change, when it finally happens, needs to be abrupt, painful, and often insufficient. Slow collapse doesn't just destroy structures. It reduces possibilities before anyone even realizes they exist. This type of disappearance is almost never discussed openly because it is uncomfortable. He doesn't offer simple lessons. It doesn't fit into motivational phrases. It requires recognizing that the biggest risk is not in making mistakes quickly, but in avoiding decisions while everything seems normal. It requires accepting that silence is not neutral. It shapes behaviors, decisions, and destinies. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this process is how common it is. It is repeated in large and small companies, in different sectors, in different cultures. Not because everyone makes the same technical mistakes, but because they share the same human standards. The fear of discomfort, excessive reliance on the past, the difficulty of acting without external pressure, the silence that sets in when no one wants to be the first to say that something needs to change. And this is exactly why this collapse is rarely perceived as a collapse while it is happening. It disguises itself as routine, stability, maturity. It moves forward while the company still believes it is in control. When it finally reveals itself, it doesn't come as an absolute surprise. It comes as a belated confirmation of something that had already been felt, but never verbalized. Slow collapse is not sudden end. It is the end result of a long, silent, and deeply human process. A process that keeps repeating itself because it is rarely named while it can still be stopped. If you've made it this far, It's because something in this video missed you, not as entertainment but as recognition. This type of content is not made for distracted viewers. It is made for those who have seen decisions being postponed, signals being ignored, and companies operating normally while something important was lost in silence. If this rings true for you, consider subscribing to the channel, not as an automatic gesture, but as a conscious choice to follow analyses that go beyond the surface of the business and into the human behavior behind decisions. If any part of this video reminded you of a real situation, a company, a leader, a team, or even a phase in your own professional career, leave it in the comments. You can write something simple, like, "The silence was deceiving. Everything seemed normal. I've seen this happen." Or, "This is more common than it seems." No need to explain too much. Sometimes a short sentence says it all. These comments show that this topic is not theoretical, that it is alive in the experience of those who watch, and help this conversation reach more people. And if you made it to the end of the video, leave a like. Not as empty support, but as a sign that this type of deep reflection still has room. Because as long as silent decisions continue to be made, stories like this will continue to repeat themselves, and someone needs to be willing to look into them before it's too late.